Phil, thank you so much for taking the time. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. As we always do it when we start our conversations, please give us a short introduction. Who are you and how did you end up here?
Amazing. Hey, Jonas, it's a pleasure to be on. I've also been really looking forward to a good conversation here on a rainy Friday afternoon in London. Who is Phil? I am originally from Canada, but I happen to also have passports from the UK and the US and Ukrainian and Polish heritage. So in a sense, I feel very NATO, very transatlantic in that regard. My dad's from the UK and my mom is Canadian born, but with Polish Ukrainian heritage. I have been in London for just a short period of time because right now I work for a very fast growing defense technology startup called Stark. What does that mean? It means I am Phil Lockwood. I am not Tony Stark. I am not Iron Man in any sense of the word, but I have a pretty exciting job, I think, nonetheless, in being able to help this company look at the NATO alliance and think about what are the types of technologies and capabilities that we can develop to help fill really critical capability gaps that the NATO alliance has right now in a time of very distinct threat, particularly on our eastern flank, but I think just in general across the globe. So I work with Stark on our technology roadmap. I also look at our overall growth and our global expansion across various markets. And so it's been a really interesting journey being with this company. Before that, I used to be at NATO headquarters where I ran the NATO Innovation Unit. We'll probably get into that at some point. And I have also been a corporate lawyer on both sides of the ocean. And before that, I was in the Canadian military doing a whole bunch of different tasks, primarily in the special duties, special operations community.
Phenomenal. So I'd love to right away dig into the technologies, but let's park this for a second there. We'll get
Okay,
to it in a
fine.
second. I'm always curious to understand what the golden thread is through people's lives and very different stages in your case, certainly when you're, military, lawyer, NATO, and now one of the fastest growing, or if not the fastest growing, defense tech startups in Europe. What do you think is the golden thread?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, to be clear, I have ADHD. And so this is, I think, one of those don't try this at home kinds of career paths. It doesn't always make sense, and even in my brain, depending on what's going on with the hamster wheel. But I think there's a few pieces. One, we were chatting about our parents a little bit earlier on. And I remember as a kid being really inspired by my father, my uncle, my grandfather, all of whom were futurists in a sense and really liked to use new innovative technologies and to think about what was on the cutting edge and what was on the horizon. Really big sci-fi fans. And so kind of being in that atmosphere always made me think about the possibility of innovation of mankind. We can really do extraordinary things. And I think you even look back to folks like Jules Verne and the Nautilus and Dozen Leagues Under the Sea, or the fact that today companies are building high energy lasers to shoot down drones. And it's like you go back to Star Wars from the 1970s, and we're thinking about shooting down droids. I think that's really exciting. So I think my whole life I've been interested in technology and what that can offer in various landscapes. And that was something I dealt with in my military career quite a bit, what I was interested in as a lawyer, and then obviously my time at NATO and after. I think the other one, though, was I also came from a family that had military heritage, and I was always interested in the military and in defense. And I was lucky enough to grow up in Canada, which is this amazingly stable country, I think, compared to the rest of the world, and a peace-loving country that has opened its doors to people from around the world to go and find a home, regardless of what's going on in the chaos of the world around. And so call me really altruistic, but I think admiring the fact that I lived in a country that could provide that stability and admiring that it was the military and democracies that was able to provide that environment always inspired me to do the same. And so, I was 16 when I joined the Army Reserves in Canada. And I've always been interested in defense, and I've wanted to do that personally as a career. And that really solidified itself at 20 years old. And I was in university at the time, wasn't sure if I was going to go down the defense route, or I was actually thinking about maybe music as a career path. And I lost a good friend of mine in the military who was killed in action overseas in Afghanistan. And when that happened, I'd been pretty close with his father, who's also in the military with me. That kind of made my mind of, actually, if I want to go around for the rest of the world, I'd like to be doing things to help keep people safe and to work in the military environment. That's been the common thread. And, the path to law and all that was more because I had been a military operator on the ground and had seen, working in the capability I was in, the impact of senior decision makers and policymakers in capital writing things, putting on certain obligations that didn't make sense in the operational context or environment. In other words, people were making decisions about the safety and security of our soldiers, our forces, and also those of our allies without ever having an understanding of what it might be like to get shot at. And yeah, that really inspired me to go and do policy work. And I went to law school because I wanted to try and bring more of an operator's perspective to policymaking and policy work in the long term. And it's a bit of a roundabout path, but that really got me into that space.
I think this is something which is not only problem, I'd say, within a military context or defense context. I feel like there's lots of detachment when it comes to operating in whatever field and people making policies for it. If it's, ESG or sustainability stuff or defense or you name it, there's a massive detachment. And I always find it absolutely unbelievably important when people which actually have operational experience make their way in that room, because you bring completely different perspectives. I see that myself often as well, on a completely different level. For example, someone who has been a mechanic is by design a better engineer than someone who has just been studying engineering, because they have no idea how it works.
Yeah.
Obviously, after that introduction part, I have to ask, music. So, are you playing an instrument? Because you said thinking about a music career. Tell me a little bit of that.
Yeah,
If you
hidden
can.
secret that I don't get into a lot these days in this world. But I grew up with a mom who's a music teacher and then on to music school, and so I grew up playing lots of instruments. In fact, I actually joined the military in the first place because I was playing in band with some folks who were older than me, and one of them joined the Army Reserves band. And she spent the summer doing that while still in high school. She got really fit. She could do a lot of push-ups. I could not do a lot of push-ups at that time. And she got paid really well. It's like, I got to find a summer job. I could go and do that. And so I got down to the recruiting office in the armories. And the problem was, a 16-year-old boy, I get there and I see the bandsmen doing their thing with their instruments. And I played like a euphonium, which was like a small tuba. But then I saw the soldiers coming through all with their helmets and their scrim on it. And they've got
Yeah.
their machine guns and their rifles and they're looking absolutely badass. And so I'm like, one, the other. I can tell people I'm joining the military to play a tuba, or I can tell people that I'm joining the army and I get to shoot a machine gun. Here we go. So, yeah, went straight to that, which was interesting. But no, I studied music in undergrad and was focusing on that pretty heavily my first couple of years, and then kind of had this moment where my friend passed away, and that really shifted things for me. But I played classical piano and drums and a bunch of jazz on trombone and various other things. So
Very
yeah,
cool.
still love it. Still have a piano. When I joined NATO, my piano took about like 9 months to arrive. Then it was in pieces, and it took another like 18 months for them to find parts of my piano on various sides of the Atlantic Ocean. So it took a hot second to get it back, but yeah, it's here. Still do it.
Phenomenal. I think that's always really, really cool. If you have a passion, you can keep developing, and it's also a bit of balance of life, isn't it? If you have this escape, and music is always a special one, I feel like.
Huge de-stressor.
Cool. Huge de-stressor, absolutely. I'd obviously have to jump onto all bits of technology you mentioned. I always like to say when we have these conversations, what an unbelievable exciting time we're living in when it comes to technology. And, the speed of technology we're experiencing is bloody exciting. And I can absolutely identify with what you said earlier, all of these new technologies coming in. Now, I obviously have to ask you now, what are the white spots you see? What are the white spots you are working on? Please, let's now go down all of these rabbit holes. I want to hear all of the details.
Okay, overview of all of this. Back up a little bit and just, I'm going to put this all in the context of warfare and the military as opposed to just tech for tech's sake. When I was at NATO, I joined because allied heads of state agreed that for a host of technologies that were up and coming and probably game changing to society, the alliance didn't understand what they were, what to do with them, what our adversaries were doing with them, and so decided to create this unit, which was a great experience because as someone who's innately pretty curious, I had a chance to go and learn a lot about various things. And so these were artificial intelligence and autonomy and quantum technologies and biotech and energy storage, batteries, and all of these sorts of things. I think just to start, this was back in 2019, 2020. At this time, sometime between the mid 90s and the early 2000s across the alliance, and depends on which country we're talking about, the bulk of R&D funding stopped being generated by defense and started to be generated primarily more by commercially focused companies, banks, the big tech companies, etc. And what that meant was that people were now trying to solve problems for broader society. They weren't trying to solve problems like, the internet was originally ARPANET and it came from DARPA and DoD. They weren't trying to solve that problem. They were trying to solve the problems of like aspects of healthcare or transmission of data of health records in the United States, because that's just absolute chaos. And so there's this question of how do we incentivize these amazing engineers, these amazing scientists to go and start solving problems in the defense world? Or how do we take these technologies that haven't really been created thinking about defense challenges, and how do we get them incentivized to start to work with us? Because this was also just after kind of the Project Maven catastrophe with US DoD, now DOW, and Google, where Google's engineers basically walked off the job and said, absolutely not, we're not touching defense. So there's, just this recognition that defense was very out of touch with what is the cutting edge. But there's a recognition that some of these technologies have tremendous opportunities. You think about quantum, outside of the critical importance of cryptography, there's also quantum communications and quantum sensing, which is something that could threaten, the viability of every submarine underwater today if we ever are able to harness the true power of quantum sensing technologies for underwater detection, because that could make obsolete literally. I think I was just looking the other day, sorry, this is a bit of a tangent, but I think outside of the United States, the major anti-submarine warfare countries in the alliance spend over 200 billion euros just in the last 5 years alone on anti-submarine warfare. Imagine if in like 6-7 years, we have quantum sensing to such a degree where the ocean is basically like daylight for us. It's a remarkable change. And so kind of going back to your question overall on these technologies, I mean, at the end of the day, there's another really interesting paper that came out in 2019 that I've been personally very influenced by, and that came out of DARPA, and it's this concept of mosaic warfare. And it's this shift away from network-centric warfare, which is something that allied militaries have really focused heavily on, which is centralized decision-making, where we have, amazing network technologies, and we're trying to basically aggregate all of this information of command and control of where forces are located on the battlefield, whether they're blue forces, red forces, what assets we have, how things are moving, to be able to analyze and to allow the commander at the center of the battlefield to go and make decisions. Network-centric warfare at high level from a layperson, really. DARPA came out and said there's this thing called mosaic warfare, and they use this idea of a mosaic. If you look at it, you've got a mosaic, which is a whole series of, 200 tiles. And on the 200 tiles, you can see an image. If you remove a bunch of the tiles, you can still figure out the image. I think on their paper, it's a fighter plane. You can still tell it's an F-22. But you've removed certain key components. And it's this idea of disaggregating or actually distributing information and decision-making down to forward levels, and to allow manned and unmanned teaming, and to basically look at the battlefield as just a whole series of sensors which gather information, and effectors that either make decisions or take action upon that information. And so I really think about this in the context of the internet, because if you could imagine what would happen if we had a centralized internet versus the distributed one that we have, where packets can flow kind of anywhere, whatever the shortest course of direction is. If we can push decision-making out across the battlefield, that's really quite extraordinary. And we don't need a centralized command node, but we can speed up the pace of decision-making, and we can basically manage to have these sensors and effectors working alongside. And if you lose a sensor, or if you lose an effector, if you lose nodes or tiles within this mosaic, that's fine. You've got plenty of other tiles that can go and take the place. Conversely, if we talk about kind of classic military technologies or military capabilities, these assets, if we lose an aircraft carrier, or if we lose a frigate, or if we lose, our F-22, F-35, 5th gen fighter, 6th gen fighter, once those come out, we're losing a really tremendous part of our battlefield capability. Whereas if we can distribute sensors and effectors in a way that's more cost effective, that's great. So what does that really mean? I think that means that critical technologies for us are artificial intelligence, autonomy, obviously, both on the hardware and software side, which is basically the AI aspects of this, network communications, and our ability to master the electromagnetic spectrum and to be able to communicate across various nodes. These are really the cutting edge, I think, of where we're at. Maybe I'll stop there. I could go on in a couple of ways. Yeah.
No, I think that's a fantastic overview. What I always, see as a challenge as well is if you centralize too large of a package, it's a massive problem by now is cognitive overload, isn't it? Not only with the fighter themselves, but also the decision makers which move fighters or assets around. So I haven't read the paper though, but I will definitely afterwards. But this structure as a mosaic makes a whole lot of sense to me. I'm just wondering, well, everyone will have to have some information about the overall mission goals and then decide on their own macro level in the best interest of these overarching mission goals, I assume. But yeah, I guess it's always a balancing act, isn't it? Between just enough information and not too much that, people overload, so to say.
Totally. And I think we will get to understand that as, just to be clear, the technology isn't out there from an autonomy standpoint for decision making at the forward edge and real distribution of decision making amongst unmanned systems and platforms. There's no one who has solved that particular problem. That's where we're heading and where we're trending. And I have the utmost of confidence that that's gonna be solved. Whether it's going to be solved first by us or by the red team, it's a different story. But I think we will learn as we implement more of these systems and sensors. We will learn about what kinds of information needs to be pushed up the various tactical echelons from, platoon level all the way up to the, divisional level at the tactical, or even further up to operational or strategic control for defense ministers or the 4-stars who run the various military forces. I think that it will be, there's nothing new under the sun, right? So in NATO orders, we follow this framework called SMESC, Situation, Mission, Execution, Service and Support Command and Signals. And within the mission orders framework, when you're giving orders to military forces, under execution, one of the first things that you talk about is something called commander's intent. And it's this idea of ensuring that the people who are following orders understand what you as the mission lead want to accomplish. But then the commander's intent is what is the commander above the mission lead intent? And you might go 1, 2, 3, however many layers up to make sure that they understand what is it that we're actually trying to accomplish. The Iraq and Afghanistan wars in the early 2000s, in the knots. And so we talked about this in the context of like the strategic corporal. So like empowering the individual humans that were at the forward edge of the battlefield to go and make decisions that the commander doesn't need to know, just to be able to take that initiative and do things. We are doing now, and we will continue to do at greater scales, the exact same thing, just with machines. We have to have the assurance that those machines will go and do what we say they will do. And we have to have assurance about how they will act and decide, and then review that and review the information that's passed up. But, at the end of the day, a battle group commander or a brigade commander for one of NATO's forward land forces on the eastern flank, who's a colonel or a 1-star, doesn't need to know about every single ISR drone that's out there and what its targeting packages are dictating. He needs to know she needs to know the broader elements, because things get pushed up bit by bit, because that cognitive overload, as you talked about, is super, super real, especially given the scope of information that's generated on today's battlefields. If you look at what's going on with Ukraine and the team that created Delta, as an example, their digital backbone, it's extraordinary. I would wager that on any individual day in the Ukraine conflict, you are generating more information than all of the paperwork that you would see maybe over the course of World War II. I wouldn't be shocked by that, given the amount of sensors that we're talking about.
Yeah. And then, this is the reality on the one side. And then on the other side, I have conversations with militaries, and they are telling me that they are currently working on improving their processes of transferring data from pieces of paper into a digital system, where they still collate data and information on paper, and now they want to bring this together to then put it into a digital system. And I'm like, guys, why go to the digital to the paper in the first place? Yeah, no, it's just the processes we have. And like, no, you need to rethink the processes. I mean, you're not going to be fast enough in many of these instances.
100%. Just on that point for one quick sec, I actually feel like we kind of deride that, and I make fun of that all the time, just as an aside. It's kind of a little bit like the US healthcare system, which is an utter mess. I lived in the States for a number of years, and so I got to see all the individual paperwork that was hard paper, and the fact that there's no centralized healthcare system that digitizes all of that. Then I moved to Belgium, which was amazing. Country is so forward-leaning when it comes to healthcare. We're doing the same thing with the military. I think that step towards digitization is actually maybe the hardest step. I think once we get there, things become a lot easier. But until we've completed this digital transformation and have come up with a general framework for this and have actually affected that, we're going to be in trouble. And we're not there. I mean, to be clear, I know the folks who are working on NATO's digital transformation, and that to me seemed like a challenge too far. I like to solve hard problems. That was a problem I never wanted to tackle.
Yeah. No, 100%. All right. So at this point, I feel like after we started with an overview on the technology and you mentioning specifically AI, autonomy, and communication, I think it is about time that you give a little bit of an overview of what Stark actually does for the few people who have not heard of Stark before.
Absolutely. Happy to. Stark is a really extraordinary, very fast growing company here in Europe that is looking to build software defined hardware for today's battlefield, which is the future battlefield, the battlefield of the future. We think that that's already here. So what does that mean? We were created last year in response to specific requests from the armed forces of Ukraine and also the German Bundeswehr, to a team of engineers to be able to build an autonomous strike drone, one-way effector, loitering munition, a bunch of different names for that, for deployment in Ukraine. Something that would be AI enabled, so it would be able to leverage AI where the communication between the human operator and the drone might fail. Because obviously in Ukraine, we have this horribly polluted electromagnetic spectrum. A lot of electronic warfare degrades communications. And so if we can get the strike drone to do more of that on its own, it increases the fidelity of mission success. So our job was to go and build a medium range strike drone that was capable of hitting key targets quite far behind the line of contact. And Stark was able to do that really quickly and really effectively. I think within 3 or 4 months of our first employees coming online, we had a prototype that we were flying in Ukraine and then continued doing that for months on end. Fast forward, we've now had contracts from NATO nations, and we have been flying that drone, which is called Virtus, in Ukraine all summer long and having operational impact and taking out key targets on the Russian side. And so the company was created with that as our first product. But out of that viewpoint and vision, and we'll maybe get into a little bit later on, kind of the why Stark was created specifically, but it was there to be the first real venture-backed startup in Europe that was focused on defense systems, whether those are weapon systems or sensing systems or platforms or networks. The goal was this is a company that is geared entirely for defense and just defense. There's no dual use, no nothing. Is our customers are the military forces of the NATO alliance, and that's kind of that. And so Stark is also really interesting among startups. It's again, a don't try this at home. We believe in building multiple products and in fact multiple product families at the same time because we want to solve problems for allied forces across operational domains. And so that means we're not just building loitering munitions. We are building different types of capabilities and products for land, for air, for the maritime domains. In fact, just last week, we announced the launch of our maritime division with 2 different unmanned surface vessels. So maritime drones, drone boats for all intents and purposes. So Stark is building a variety of different hardware capabilities, unmanned systems across operational domains. We're building strike platforms and ISR platforms, and we do all of that as a vertically integrated company. In other words, we do all of the software ourselves. What does that look like? We kind of have 2 elements. We call it Minerva as a whole. So we have Minerva Edge, which is the autonomy on the platform itself. So the onboard AI and the software for various aspects of the system's functioning. And then we also do Minerva Frontline, which is the digital backbone to link all these different capabilities together and is focused on unmanned systems and doing mission control, command and control. And so that is also a multi-domain platform. And so by virtue of having drones that fly and drones that float, we have a system that can connect those types of systems together and then allow operators to engage in various tasks. So yeah, Stark is ultimately building a wide variety of products. We have probably over a dozen underway right now, probably about a half dozen or so at a TRL 7 or so mark. TRL 7 is technology readiness level 7. So we're in prototype stage and really testing them alongside operators.
Fantastic. How many people are you guys within Stark by now?
So we are, it's really hard to tell because I think a couple times a month we've got the welcome the new, 50 joiners, 30 joiners, whatever it is. And so it's really hard to keep track. I think there was an article that just came out that said that we had like 30,900% growth in the last year, but we're probably somewhere definitely over about 250 people.
Mega.
Yeah.
I also love that you say, we're working on a variety of different products because, I had these conversations with investors and stuff for a long time. Isn't it funny because VCs, what they want from a startup is usually you guys need to focus.
It's ruthless focus, 100%.
Yeah. But a couple of years ago, I started playing around with investors because it really annoyed me, because we also developed multiple different product ranges and all that stuff. And I said, well, let's just do a short thought experiment. Yeah. So you get your money from LPs, which spread their money across a whole range of different things. You then take that money and spread it across a whole range of different startups. Which magic rule, financial rule, appears here all of a sudden from the level of one startup, focus magically appears and needs to be done. It goes against all rules of what we know of investing and diversification and all that stuff. And funny enough,
go ahead, please.
Funny enough, most don't really. Of course, they say, it's difficult to make one product work. Yeah, I get it. But if you have 5 products in your bucket, the chance of one working really well is just simply larger. But anyway, that's just one thing I can relate with personally very well.
So 2 points on that. The first one is, so focus has to happen somewhere. And even at Stark, we're kind of like, well, let's just push focus down and we'll go and talk to certain teams within certain kind of product divisions or product families. Like, this is your focus. But even then, it's hard to do that. And sometimes there's so many interesting problems to solve, and we want to take a stab at various ones. We're still early enough that we're also still finding our way. We have some key products like Virtus, like the vessels that we unveiled during Repmus that obviously we're focusing really heavily on with our customer engagement. But that focus, and so there's focus there, but also I think by diversifying, that enables us to think better across domains and to think about how these products work across domains. And our ambition is to be one of the worst words out there, but to be a prime contractor. We want to be a company that directly engages with customers, both actual operators as well as the acquisition and procurement teams that are responsible for purchasing. And we want to be there helping them solve problems. In a world of Mosaic warfare, in a world of, another buzzword, multi-domain operations, if you just are building one product in one area, it's really hard to actually act as an overall partner to the end user.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more with what you just said. The more you understand, the better you understand the complexities, especially in such a complex and critical system like defense.
Yeah.
And also the customer engagement, I think, is really, really critical that you do this, and you do this with your operators. And I know you guys are, putting a lot of effort and also being in Ukraine, testing in Ukraine, which you already mentioned, which, is something I think cannot be said often enough. If you do not engage in what is going on in reality today, you have no chance to withstand the challenges which are ever evolving and this so quickly nowadays. So you need this constant exchange of information of what is going on, what are the new adjustments, and also really doing this in a proper way. And I'm sure you think about that a lot, is don't just solve today's problem. Something I feel so frustrated by, you need to solve tomorrow's problems, because guess what? If the drone is flying 2 kilometers high today, in 2 weeks' time, it will be flying 3 kilometers if this is how it can outmaneuver your air defense. So it is a really, really complex overall system, I feel like, and it's hard to grasp sometimes.
There's also, I mean, from an investment risk perspective, there's also a diversification. Like defense is a very complicated and tricky world. And especially given the stage we're at right now as a company, getting a feel for different markets and getting exposure and getting a chance to see traction, we're lucky enough to have raised enough capital and to also have enough experts on our team across various functions to be able to do this and pursue this. And that's actually, for me, a really big de-risking in the defense space. And quite frankly, most companies don't have the luxury of doing that. Yeah, it's a challenge.
It is a challenge, but I think this is the way to go. Only if you get the best people for the specific fields, this is how you win or have a chance in making it through multiple of these subdomains. I'd love to jump a little bit back to what you said earlier. So earlier you said you work on AI-enabled systems. Can you maybe specify a little bit? Or you said, autonomous software-defined hardware. Can you maybe define what AI-enabled means for everyone listening in?
Sure. So there's a number of ways in which it plays into effect. But I think the idea is there's a host. When we are talking about the sheer number of sensors on the battlefield, or even within an individual autonomous platform, so an unmanned platform, there's usually multiple sensors or reasonably high quality sensors. So commercial technology and commercial electronics have gotten to such a point in our society that we're able to build these types of platforms reasonably quickly. By leveraging AI at the edge or embedding AI into the hardware itself, we are then able to outsource decision making to that hardware, which can then go and take a number of actions that make it more effective for an ultimate operator. And you don't have the cognitive overload of the operator who has to process and inject and direct every single thing that the system has to do. So, let's put it into something that's easy to understand and use navigation as a case. So any kind of unmanned system, whether it's a UAV, unmanned aircraft system, or unmanned ground vehicle, or an unmanned surface vessel on the water, we need them to be able to travel certain distances and to go from one location to another to navigate. How we can do that without having a human with a map and a compass there, or an onboard GPS to say, hey, go left, right, whatever, is by using onboard sensors, which are typically cameras, but also other systems. So inertial navigation systems, we might be measuring barometric pressure, temperature, all these sorts of things to get an idea of where is this object in time and space. And then from there to instruct the propulsion system and the navigation system on board to go and say, hey, you need to make adjustments to continue on this particular course you're heading. And by virtue of doing that, we then have an unmanned system that is capable of traveling on its own, and we don't have to have a human who is actually making that AI travel. In other words, you don't need to have an FPV drone with an individual with goggles and a mask steering the drone and saying, here's where we go. Because if we do that, I think I read a stat most recently, don't know if it's true, but something to the effect of about 100,000 FPV drone operators in Ukraine. That's a lot of people. And if we think about NATO forces as an example, we do not have 100,000 FPV drone operators, nowhere close. And the time it takes for a human to learn how to do that really effectively is quite significant in terms of training. So if we can leverage AI on board to do the navigation and to do, most of the movements and the decision making on board through the sensor data that's picked up, that's amazing. And because of the ease of access to high quality compute systems at low cost that we can place on these systems, then we're in a really good place, at least to start. It doesn't mean that it's solved. It's just we're getting better at it.
This is exactly what I just wanted to ask. Like, if you would have to rate it or give some kind of feeling, where are we there today?
I think it depends on operational domain. So I think we're in a pretty good place when we are flying UAS over land in particular, because you can use cartography and you can use computer vision to be able to navigate reasonably effectively. So that's awesome. When we talk about the maritime domain, for example, that's really complicated because if you don't have a seashore to reference, ocean water generally looks about the same. It's kind of a blue, green, dark, whatever. I mean, maybe when you're on a Caribbean beach, it's a little different, but when you're out to sea, it's really different. And you've got challenges like, so what about navigation by night sky, how sailors did back in the day? That's awesome if you can see the stars, but what if it's not nighttime? And what if there's cloud cover, as there
Mm-hmm.
often tends to be when you don't want it to be there? So how do we navigate when you think about currents, you think about waves, etc.? And it's further along there, and people haven't come up with concrete solutions for that. And there's different things you can do. Like there's theories about tapping into the Earth's natural magnetic layer and magnetism to go and measure that, and then to use basically complex trigonometry. We've got lots of satellites in space. So what about Doppler frequency calculations to be able to go and identify position, navigation, timing? There's again, this is another place where quantum sensing can come into play. So technologies are definitely emerging, but we haven't solved this problem necessarily.
I'd love to ask a little bit of a wild question. So when I'm hearing software defined, but also hardware in this very complex environment we're finding ourselves today, I almost ask myself, where are we right now? Who follows what? Is it software that follows hardware? Is it hardware that follows software? It's like, almost a chicken egg problem, isn't it? Or in my head, at least. And I'd love to get your insights. Where are we there today? Because software is getting more and more powerful. But for example, Florian Seibel is known to be an advocate for, don't bloody underestimate the hardware. It's
Hardware is
critical.
hard.
Hardware is hard. So I'd love to have your point of view there.
It can't be an either or question. Just to be really clear, it's all very important. But it is interesting because there are some companies out there that take a software first approach to solving problems in the defense space. We know who some of those are. And then there's companies like Quantum Systems and Florian's approach of hardware is hard and let's get after it. I think companies can have a spike on either one. I think it tends to be that companies don't spike on both. I actually really think about it as three legs to a stool rather than two. And I think that they're still slightly separate from each other. And so I think of the three pillars here as a pillar of software. I think we have a pillar of hardware, so hardware R&D and development and mechanical engineering and electrical engineering, et cetera. And then we have a third a pillar that we can't forget about. The people who are subject matter experts in those first two pillars are not subject matter experts, and that's in the world of production.
Mm-hmm.
And that itself can be subdivided into manufacturing itself and supply chain and the act of supplying all of the components and systems that are necessary for the end products for production purposes. And in today's day and age, the whole idea of this mosaic warfare concept that we've been talking about is to be able to have networks of massive amounts of systems where we're less focused on having dominance of any one system over an adversarial system, but we're actually looking at dominance through aggregation and through the attritability. So can we lose that system from an economic perspective, and are we causing a greater harm than them? We're looking at it from a lethality perspective. We're looking at it from an information collection perspective. Can we win the information war?
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can't produce these systems in mass at lower costs, then we're in the same boat that we were in with regards to building nuclear submarines that take 7-8 years or whatever it might be. And so I think that it's all three pillars have to be running. Software is really important, and there are some companies that will have business cases just on building software that's really critical, and that then has to get integrated for everything else. For a company like Stark that is trying to be vertically integrated and to produce both platforms and that digital backbone, we have to be good at all three of those pillars.
Yeah, I love that you built this on three pillars. And when it comes to manufacturing and supply chain, I have a recent obsession when it comes to supply chains and really understanding approaches around supply chains, because bloody hell, it is a complicated process, especially in a European context where other nations are in so much control when it comes to our resources, but also the industry to make these raw materials usable. So I'd love to hear your take on supply chains there. If you have any.
First things first, if it didn't come through earlier, I'm kind of a jack of all trades, master of all none. My spikes might be in music and law and whatever.
Okay.
All that is to be said, I think I know enough about supply chains to make myself dangerous. And for folks out there who are listening, who are supply chain gurus, please forgive me in advance. But when I was at NATO, we'd done some investigations into supply chain for drone components, and we were really concerned about what we saw there. At the end of the day, this is an area that China has dominated for a really long time because part of the whole idea was to outsource manufacturing. I was on stage earlier this week with someone who used to work at Apple, and they talked about how Apple learned very quickly on outsource the manufacturing, get it over to China, focus on the aspects of hardware here and do that. And that's all fine, but now it's biting us in the ass of how much we've outsourced to China and how much we've relied on them with regards to key raw materials, rare earth metals, et cetera, that are really critical for components. I still don't know the answer to whether we've been able to find alternatives to certain certain rare earth metals that are found, as far as I know, primarily or if only in China, that we use for motors for drones. That's a really major concern. And it can't be, from my perspective, the fact that we don't have access to the raw materials anywhere across the NATO alliance or her allies. When you look at the High North, for example, I think that's another reason why we're going to see a very contested space in the Arctic, because the sheer amount of raw materials there that are really critical for our supply chain. And now with global warming and the Arctic becoming a little less inhospitable, we have an ability to extract that, which is critical, but also not something that's going to be solved overnight, and is something that I think should be keeping us up at night if we're thinking about the potential for a threat or another, global war could be within the next couple of years or so. So if that's the case, we haven't had the time to really diversify our supply chain and to bolster it organically on our own. I think that's something that we're working to do dramatically. Obviously, this is something that STAR cares about a lot and is putting quite a bit of time and money into, but it's also something that STAR can't solve on its own. This is where public-private partnerships are absolutely critical, and it has to be fostered together with industry working, competitors and allies alike working together to ensure that we're able to maneuver this. I'll maybe stop there.
I'm still surprised today that we don't really have national stockpiles of critical raw materials. How's that a thing? I mean, it's not, I'm not asking for a question, for an answer there, but, we have centralized gas, we have, energy storages and all of these things, but when it comes to critical raw materials, it's not really, and if then, very small. So I guess it's just my way of saying, everyone in charge, we need to move quickly on supply chains and ensuring that we stay in control of our own manufacturing, because manufacturing and, deterrence by production, I think, is pretty critical for the next couple of years.
Totally. That reminded me a little bit, by the way, of one thing I'd love to just touch on, which is allied nations or allied leaders or subject matter experts that look at what's going on in the Ukraine conflict and say, that's not how we would fight and that's not how we would work. And so let's ignore some of these lessons. And one of the areas in which I've heard that the most is in the context of Taiwan, and if there was an invasion of Taiwan by China. Because what I hear from some of these folks is we really need to be very careful, or in some cases, Ukraine is just a red herring when it comes to Taiwan, because Ukraine has an ability to produce components and to be able to manufacture autonomous systems at scale because it has a supply chain that's less threatened, or it basically has land borders to Europe that allow it to gain access to a lot of components and whatnot that's necessary. And so in the case of Taiwan, which is an island, where are things at? And just to be clear, Taiwan wasn't my bailiwick at NATO. It's not my bailiwick now. So I don't know the extent to which they've been stockpiling, but I really hope so. And I know that there are a lot of folks who are thinking about resupply to Taiwan from a naval route perspective, because that would be really critical to their capacity to fight a protracted campaign.
It's something which we all should put an extreme amount of effort into this. But I would love to talk about two almost final points, being aware of the time, although I'd love to continue chatting with you about. So two things, I guess. I'd love to hear your thoughts on, and feel free to shoot out stuff which is maybe a little bit unconventional or is outside of the ordinary when it comes to expectations. Where's the industry going over the next 5 to 10 years, and what do you think we would be, what is your forecast of things we would be surprised about today?
Okay, so where is the industry going to in the next 5 years? I think that much sooner than 5 years, we are going to be in a position where all of the debates about lethal autonomous weapon systems will be more or less solved or concluded by at least within the NATO alliance and her partners. Because I think that in the very short term, we are going to move away from this idea of humans in the loop when it comes to AI and weapon systems. And I think that we're going to have to shove off of humans in the loop for all the reasons that we talked about in terms of overload or the ability of the human to decide, or the fact that we're just not going to be able to communicate with the systems. And we are absolutely in a place where the technology will be there or is already there to be able to provide assurance of autonomous systems to identify a target, to make a decision to act in respect to that target, and then to take the effect, even at a lethal perspective. And I think we have to do that because our adversaries and competitors are also working on this, and that will be accessible to them, and they will not hesitate to do that. And they will probably do that at much lower levels of assurance than we currently have or we would be comfortable with. And so for us as an alliance, and certainly for Stark as a company, we are looking very heavily at how do we, from the very beginning of developing our products, how do we responsibly develop that and think about AI assurance across all aspects? Because what I think we'll get to is the commander becoming comfortable with the idea of a certain targeting framework has been uploaded into the platform, into the system. The commander is comfortable with the system then making the decision to act, including the use of lethal force under preset conditions. This is something that we've done for a really long time, by the way. When we were in Afghanistan and Iraq, we created what were called kill boxes all the time. So particular areas. And if something happened in that area, if you spotted an adversary in that area, you wouldn't have to wait for them to fire at you first. It was just, no, go and execute on that contact. The same thing will happen with AI. And I think that will happen very, very soon. And I think it has to, because again, this idea of mass is really critical to be able to overwhelm our adversary with mass. And we can't do that on a 1-to-1 ratio of our operators to individual systems. So it's really, really critical that we solve the assurance, the responsible aspects of that, and become comfortable with that all the way to the highest levels of decision makers, including at the political level, and also for our societies to become aware of this. Because I think the idea of killer robots is scary. I'm not really excited for a future where we have a Terminator robot and Arnold Schwarzenegger coming back, or actually whoever the guy was that played the Terminator in the second movie that was like unkillable. Just to be very clear, we're nowhere close to that. And sentience and AI, we don't have general AI. I think we're probably still a ways off on that. I'm a little more skeptical, but I do think we're going to be in a position where autonomous systems will be doing more decision making at the edge in respect to that.
Fantastic. What is your take on the drone wall?
And the drone wall, I like it. I think that it's easy to make fun of as we have a wall. People think of a fence, and there's a whole bunch of autonomous systems or counter UAS systems that are there. I was actually really lucky last month to get out to Lithuania for the pilot of Task Force X, which is kind of the innovative component of the Eastern Flank deterrence line. So this is coming from NATO Landcom and from U.S. Army Europe, General Donahue, who's a 4-star, and it's this idea of how are we going to ensure a deterrence line on our eastern flank against Russia? And in particular, with a focus on our forward land forces. So the 9, I guess there's soon going to be brigades that run from, I think it should be Finland all the way down south. I think this goes back to everything we've been saying: manned, unmanned teaming, decision-making at the edge, distributing out warfare, and learning how to do that effectively. We need massive amounts of unmanned systems on the flank. And we also need to be able to figure out how to counter unmanned systems effectively. Not sure if the answer, by the way, to that is interceptor drones, either piloted by a person or piloted by AI with a kinetic edge. But, we'll see what happens on that front. Yeah, the fact of the matter, though, is we need a variety of offensive and defensive tools, both leveraging the existing capabilities that we do have. But then there's also a massive gap in terms of the number of systems that we have. Like, it changes from nation to nation what you would outfit a brigade with in terms of unmanned systems. But often we're talking in single digits or small double digits. That is not how a brigade in Ukraine or a Russian equivalent fights at all today. Again, that goes to that mass battle, mass question. We really need to get prepared for that. So that means getting more of these systems to these brigades and learning about how they fight and learning how to integrate them and learning by doing as many exercises as we possibly can. We can't send NATO brigades to Ukraine, but we can exercise the shit out of them within the eastern flank and the training areas, etc.
It's more than 4,000 kilometers of border, right, with NATO and Russia. And I mean, the challenges I see there, I mean, the first thing is building up this so-called drone wall. And I think almost the bigger challenge is keeping it up. Because imagine you need to buy all of these systems, you need to fit millions and millions of sensors, and then you need to keep up to the ever-evolving and changing threats. So, it's going to be an unbelievable task, however the solution for that looks like. But, the longer I think about it, the more I'm like, holy moly, this is a very, very big task to keep up any kind of defenses in that
It's huge because there's this transition, and sorry to interrupt, but there's this transition from peacetime to wartime that could happen like this. I mean, most likely we will see Russian forces massing and we'll have an idea and we'll be able to start to get ready. It probably will not be a surprise on the day. We'll probably know within a window of weeks or maybe even months. We won't know more than that, though, necessarily. And we need to think about our civilian regulations that dictate what we can fly or not fly when it comes to unmanned systems or how we use them and how we can make sure that they're not interfering with this training and exercises that are necessary to learn. We also need to think about our procurement programs and policies where too many nations still think about it as in, like, the amount of countries that have asked us about life cycle storage for our unmanned systems, for our loitering munitions. And they're like, can you store that battery for more than 5 years? Like, what about 10 years? Are you absolutely nuts? You think this system's going to be relevant in 10 years? What a waste of your taxpayers' funding. Like, that's absolutely not. This is loitering munitions, unmanned systems in general are changing and evolving so quickly that I think we need to think about procurement processes where it's more along the lines of, like, let's provide some assurance that supply chain that we have to bolster long term so they know there's going to be orders in the long term, can spoil up, hire people who are secure in their jobs. Yes, absolutely. So have a long term, maybe it's a 10-year framework contract, but then you have deliveries every couple of years. And we also have to be willing to throw away systems that we might not have used because they're there for deterrence rather than just defense. And then we need to figure out...
training.
And training, exactly. Training also provides deterrence in a sense because Russia sees us using things, China sees us using things, Iran sees us using things, third-party non-state actors see us working with this, and they say, oh, that's really interesting, or makes us think twice. So there's a lot that has to happen here. I'm optimistic overall, though, that we'll solve it, and it's mostly just because it's existential right now. And I think enough people realize that.
And I almost see contracts work in, along the lines of almost a framework contract slash service agreement where, customer buys a service, which might in that case be defense of that certain area against certain defined threats. And it just been an evolving story, which, I just think we need to be more flexible to come closer to reality. But, that is
drones as a service now. It's, There
you go. Drones as a service. Mega. Okay, fantastic. I think that was great. What I always like to ask at the end is if our listeners take away one thing of the entire conversation we just had, what would be the one thing you want to give them?
I mean, it really depends on the lister. I hope that there's a few here. If it's a procurement acquisition specialist, it's to think about what we just talked about there. And let's iterate and evolve on the frameworks so that we can produce systems that continue to be fit for purpose. So anything that we can do to make sure that our procurement programs are adaptable and they evolve with time so that we're very comfortable with changing the requirements of the contract, I think is really huge. If you're in the political landscape, then anything you can do to tackle supply chain assurance, whether that's from stockpiling or looking at new bold ways of public-private partnerships to provide that long-term assurance for the supply chain, for the most critical components. I think same thing if you're a venture investor. I think, yes, look at pure defense companies and drone companies and all that. I know there's lots of companies that are playing in the space. Please do support them, but also please look very heavily at the companies that are making components, because I think that's actually going to be where there's going to be major wins in the future. So maybe I'll throw those three out, and that's it for the day.
Phil, thank you so much for taking the time. I really, really enjoyed it. And
back at you.
I guess we have to do a second episode at some point to extend on all of that.
We'll see how it goes. You can call me out in 12 months when not every drone is at Terminator level and saying I'll be back.
And we don't have the drones as service yet. But that's on me. No, Phil, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Awesome. Jonas, This was great.